Eleanor Sinclair had it all. Wealth, power, a wedding fit for royalty. But on the most important night of her life, one humiliating act shattered everything. Her groom, Damon Caldwell, thought he owned her, thought he could control her, but he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated her. What happened next left an entire city in shock. How did a bride turn the tables and destroy the man who tried to break her? Watch till the end to find out. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Eleanor Sinclair stood before the grand, full-length mirror in the bridal suite, her reflection a vision of perfection. The gown, an exclusive custom piece from a Parisian designer, clung to her slender frame in ivory silk, embroidered with delicate silver threading that shimmered under the soft chandelier light. A tiara, small yet elegant, nestled in the rich, dark waves of her hair, the final touch to an image of effortless grace. To the world, she was the embodiment of a fairy tale bride. But fairy tales were for fools. Eleanor inhaled deeply, forcing down the unease that had been growing in the pit of her stomach for months. This was supposed to be the most important day of her life, the pinnacle of everything her family had built. A merger in the form of a marriage, a strategic alignment between the Sinclair Empire and the last shreds of what remained of the Caldwell dynasty. She knew what this was, and yet there had been a time, however brief, when she had convinced herself that perhaps this could be something more, that beneath Damon Caldwell's perfect veneer, beyond his aristocratic charm and cultured voice, there might have been a man worth standing beside. She had ignored the warning signs, dismissed the subtle condescension in his tone when he spoke of her work, the almost imperceptible sneer when she outmaneuvered him in conversation. She had wanted to believe that this marriage, while not born from love, could at least be built on mutual respect. She had been wrong. The final nail in that illusion had come just last night. A conversation, one she was never meant to hear. A hushed exchange between Damon and his closest confidant, Elias Harrington, over a glass of whiskey in the study of the Caldwell estate. "Smartest move I ever made," Damon had mused, his voice carrying just enough arrogance to curdle her stomach. "My rover, marriage or business?" Elias had chuckled. "Same thing," Damon had replied easily. "She thinks she's getting a husband. I'm getting an empire." Eleanor had stood frozen in the shadowed corridor, her breath shallow, her fingers curling so tightly against the banister that her nails had threatened to split. There had been no affection in Damon's voice, no hint of partnership, only the cold certainty of a man who had already counted his spoils. And she was one of them. A soft knock at the door pulled her back to the present. She turned to see her mother, Vivian Sinclair, sweeping into the room with the same regal grace she had carried her entire life. Dressed in a deep sapphire gown, she was the image of quiet authority, her gaze sharp as it assessed Eleanor from head to toe. "You look perfect," Vivian murmured, reaching out to adjust a single stray curl near Eleanor's temple. "Exactly as you should." Eleanor forced a smile. As if there were any other option. Vivian's lips twitched, the closest she ever came to amusement. "No, darling, there never was." Behind her, the door opened once more, and her father, Frederick Sinclair, entered, with his usual measured steps. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing, a force of nature in the business world, feared and respected in equal measure. He did not waste words on sentimentality. "Are you ready?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Eleanor met his gaze through the mirror, searching for something. Reassurance, perhaps. or permission to do what she had wanted to do since last night. Walk away. But she had been raised to understand the weight of responsibility. The Sinclair name was not simply her own, it was a legacy, a power far older than love or personal desire. And so, she nodded. "I'm ready." Moments later, she was descending the grand staircase of the Sinclair estate, her movements poised, rehearsed. The towering floral arrangements, the symphony playing softly in the background, the hundreds of guests dressed in their finest. Every detail had been curated to perfection. Damon stood at the altar, a vision of refinement in a black tailored suit, his features carved from cold elegance. His gaze locked onto hers, unreadable, a well-crafted mask that hid the truth behind his calculating mind. As she reached him, he extended a hand, his fingers curling around hers with just enough pressure to assert dominance, his first mistake. She returned his grip, slightly firmer, and for the briefest moment, she saw something flicker in his gaze. Surprise. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual effortless confidence. The ceremony began. Vows were exchanged, hollow words spoken with the ease of two people who knew exactly what was expected of them. When Damon slid the ring onto her finger, it felt heavier than it should have, a shackle disguised as jewelry. Then came the kiss, a chaste press of lips, brief and devoid of warmth. The applause that followed was polite, enthusiastic even, but to Eleanor, it sounded like the closing of a cell door. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell. The reception was held in the sprawling gardens, beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. Champagne flowed, laughter rippled through the air, and conversations flitted between discussions of art, finance, and the politics of power. Damon thrived in this world, slipping through the crowd with practiced ease, his presence magnetic. Eleanor played her part flawlessly, accepting congratulations with a serene smile, nodding in all the right places. But beneath the surface, she was watching. And she was not the only one. Near the marble fountain, she caught her brother Nathaniel's gaze from across the crowd. He lifted a brow, his expression unreadable, but the message was clear. "Are you sure?" She wasn't. Not yet. But she would be. Damon, across the reception hall, laughed at something Elias said, his hand resting a fraction too long on the shoulder of an old flame. His eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as if the night had already been won. Eleanor's grip tightened around the stem of her champagne flute. He thought he had won. He had no idea. The ceremony began with the kind of grandeur that only old money and meticulous planning could achieve. A string quartet played a delicate melody, its notes floating through the cathedral-like hall of the Sinclair estate, where gold accents gleamed against towering floral arrangements. The guests sat in perfect formation, their faces aglow under the soft shimmer of candlelight. Every detail had been choreographed to perfection, from the ivory aisle runner to the diamond-studded name cards at each seat. It was, by all accounts, the kind of wedding that would be spoken of for years to come, and yet Eleanor felt nothing. Standing before the officiant, her fingers curled loosely around Damon's, she recited her vows with a voice so smooth, so practiced, that not a single person in the room would have suspected the hollowness behind them. She had spent years perfecting the art of composure, of wearing a mask so seamless that even she sometimes forgot what lay beneath it. Damon, ever the picture of aristocratic charm, delivered his vows with an ease that sent a ripple of approval through the crowd. His voice was steady, rich with carefully measured sincerity, his words crafted not for Eleanor, but for the audience that surrounded them. To have and to hold, in prosperity and in challenge, in triumph and in struggle. As we build a future together. The words dripped with the illusion of devotion, a masterful performance that had been rehearsed not in love, but in expectation. He lifted her hand, sliding the platinum band onto her finger, a weight that felt more like an unspoken contract than a promise. With this ring, I bind myself to you. Bind. Yes, that was exactly what this was. Eleanor did the same, her fingers steady as she slid the ring onto his hand, feeling the briefest tension in his palm before it relaxed. In this ring I do the same. And just like that, it was done. The applause came like a wave, polite and practiced, a symphony of approval from a room full of people who had been waiting for this moment, as if it were the final act of a long-anticipated play. Damon leaned in, his lips pressing against hers in a kiss so brief, so devoid of tenderness, that it may as well have been a mere formality. There was no heat, no warmth, just a carefully measured moment of contact before he pulled away. A perfect performance for the onlookers, who would remember this moment for years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. and Mrs. Damon Caldwell. Eleanor smiled as the room erupted in applause once more, allowing herself to be swept into the perfectly orchestrated motions of the day. The reception followed swiftly, a seamless transition from ceremony to celebration. A grand affair hosted in the sprawling gardens of the Sinclair estate. Twinkling chandeliers hung from the towering oak trees, casting golden light over the marble dance floor. Tables adorned with crystal glassware and white roses stretched across the lawn, where waiters weaved between guests with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Eleanor moved through the crowd as she had been trained to do, nodding at congratulations, shaking hands with political figures and CEOs, exchanging pleasantries with foreign dignitaries and business moguls. She had played this role her entire life, the poised daughter of the Sinclair Empire, the flawless representation of power and refinement. And yet, as she moved, as she smiled, as she exchanged words that meant nothing, she could not ignore the growing weight in her chest. Damon, meanwhile, was thriving. She watched as he moved effortlessly through the crowd, slipping into conversations with ease, laughing at all the right moments, exuding the confidence of a man who had already won. There was a lightness in the way he carried himself, a certainty in his posture, as if this was exactly where he was meant to be. And why wouldn't he be? He had secured everything he had wanted. Tying himself to the Sinclair family meant power, meant legacy, meant a future where the Caldwell name would no longer be whispered as a relic of what once was. The realization settled in her chest like a stone. She turned away, moving toward the bar, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute as she overheard hushed voices near the fountain. Two men, older, well-dressed, their conversation too casual, too knowing. Smart move on his part, one of them mused, swirling his whiskey. Tying himself to the Sinclair Empire was the only way to keep the Caldwell name afloat. The other man chuckled. He played it well. She thinks she's getting a husband. He's getting an investment. The words landed like a blade against her ribs. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her grip on the glass tightening, her gaze flicking back to where Damon stood. Laughing, his hand rested lightly on the shoulder of an old flame. Genevieve Loring, the ever-present specter of his past. A woman whose presence had never been acknowledged directly, yet had always been there, hovering just beneath the surface. Eleanor felt something inside her shift. Not pain, not heartbreak. Something colder. She had always been aware of the rules of this world. She had known from the beginning that this was not a marriage built on love, but on strategy. She had accepted that. But there was a difference between knowing something in theory and witnessing it unfold so clearly before her eyes. Damon had never respected her. He had never viewed her as his equal. He had expected her to be silent, to be complicit, to play the part of the dutiful wife who smiled on cue and accepted her role as a stepping stone in his grand plan. He had underestimated her, and that would be his greatest mistake. From across the garden, she caught Nathaniel's gaze once more. This time, she didn't look away. Her brother lifted a glass in a silent toast, his expression unreadable. Eleanor returned the gesture, her own smile slow, calculated. She had played along for long enough. It was time to rewrite the rules. The reception had taken on a life of its own. The string quartet had transitioned into a full orchestra, filling the vast garden with a melody so grand it could have belonged to a royal ball. The laughter of the guests mixed with the clinking of champagne glasses, the crisp night air humming with conversation, flirtation, and quiet negotiations disguised as pleasantries. To anyone watching, it was perfection. A seamless blend of wealth, elegance, and spectacle. Eleanor Sinclair moved through it all with the same grace she had been trained to wield since childhood. She smiled, nodded, accepted congratulations with effortless poise. If she had not been listening, she might have been fooled into believing she was the bride in the fairy tale that everyone else seemed to think she was living. But she was listening. She was always listening. Damon had not spoken to her directly since they had arrived at the reception. Not once. It wasn't surprising. He was in his element here, among the power brokers, the heirs and heiresses, the politicians and moguls. He had always thrived in spaces where the conversation was a carefully disguised game of positioning. This was where he belonged, where he felt at home. Eleanor had known this from the beginning. What she had not anticipated was how glaringly absent she would feel from it all. She had been by his side when the guests first arrived, had stood with him through the initial wave of congratulations, but once the social tides shifted and the evening took on its own rhythm, Damon had slipped into the crowd like a current moving downstream. Fluid, effortless, without a single backward glance. She had expected nothing more. And yet, as she watched him from across the ballroom, his laughter just a touch too loud, his gestures just a shade too performative, something settled in her stomach like ice. "Smile, dear." Her mother's voice was soft but firm as she appeared at Eleanor's side, a glass of champagne in hand. Vivian Sinclair had always been a woman who knew how to command a room without ever raising her voice. Her gown, a midnight blue masterpiece that shimmered under the reception lights, hugged her frame with an elegance that was both effortless and strategic. People turned when Vivian entered a room. They always had. Eleanor lifted the corners of her mouth in an automatic response. "You should mingle more," Vivian continued smoothly, as if the entire evening were a business transaction she was overseeing. "There are important people here tonight." Eleanor's fingers curled around the stem of her champagne flute. "Important to whom?" she asked, her tone deceptively light. Her mother's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flicked toward Damon across the garden. "To you, to your future." Eleanor exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to look at him. She didn't need to. She could already picture the exact scene playing out. Damon, standing at the bar, his arm resting too comfortably on the back of Genevieve Loring's chair. Genevieve, with her perfectly calculated tilt of the head, her lips painted the deep red of a woman who had never known what it was to be second choice. Damon had not spoken to her directly since they had arrived at the reception. Not once. It wasn't surprising. He was in his element here, among the power brokers, the heirs and heiresses, the politicians and moguls. He had always thrived in spaces where the conversation was a carefully disguised game of positioning. This was where he belonged, where he felt at home. Eleanor had known this from the beginning. What she had not anticipated was how glaringly absent she would feel from it all. She had been by his side when the guests first arrived, had stood with him through the initial wave of congratulations, but once the social tides shifted and the evening took on its own rhythm, Damon had slipped into the crowd like a current moving downstream. Fluid, effortless, without a single backward glance. She had expected nothing more. And yet, as she watched him from across the ballroom, his laughter just a touch too loud, his gestures just a shade too performative, something settled in her stomach like ice. "Smile, dear." Her mother's voice was soft but firm as she appeared at Eleanor's side, a glass of champagne in hand. Vivian Sinclair had always been a woman who knew how to command a room without ever raising her voice. Her gown, a midnight blue masterpiece that shimmered under the reception lights, hugged her frame with an elegance that was both effortless and strategic. People turned when Vivian entered a room. They always had. Eleanor lifted the corners of her mouth in an automatic response. "You should mingle more," Vivian continued smoothly, as if the entire evening were a business transaction she was overseeing. "There are important people here tonight." Eleanor's fingers curled around the stem of her champagne flute. "Important to whom?" she asked, her tone deceptively light. Her mother's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flicked toward Damon across the garden. "To you, to your future." Eleanor exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to look at him. She didn't need to. She could already picture the exact scene playing out. Damon, standing at the bar, his arm resting too comfortably on the back of Genevieve Loring's chair. Genevieve, with her perfectly calculated tilt of the head, her lips painted the deep red of a woman who had never known what it was to be second choice. Genevieve had been in Damon's orbit long before Eleanor. She had always been the quiet threat, lingering just beyond the edge of propriety. There had been whispers about them for years, even after Damon's engagement to Eleanor had been announced. Nothing explicit, nothing damning, just whispers. Eleanor had ignored them. Until now. She raised her glass to her lips, taking a slow sip. "And what about him?" she murmured. Vivian's eyes didn't follow her gaze. She didn't need to. "Damon is doing what is expected of him," she said, her voice smooth, unbothered. "And so are you." Eleanor turned to her mother fully now, searching for any hint of concern, any flicker of disapproval. There was none. Vivian had expected this. Of course she had. Her mother had lived in this world for decades. She had built her life on it, had trained Eleanor to navigate it the same way. This was what marriages in their world were built on. Alliances, strategy, the unspoken agreements between men and women of power. But something about this moment felt different. It wasn't the flirtation. It wasn't even the whispers. It was the fact that Eleanor had stopped caring. She smiled then. Not the kind of smile her mother had instructed her to wear. Not the poised, practiced expression of a woman fulfilling her role. It was something else. something colder. Vivian saw it. Eleanor knew she did. Her mother's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something, but before she could, a new voice cut through the hum of the evening. "You're an interesting man, Caldwell." Eleanor's head turned just in time to see her brother, Nathaniel, swirling the whiskey in his glass as he approached Damon near the bar. Damon's easy smile didn't falter, but Eleanor caught the slight tightening of his fingers around his drink. "Am I?" he said, tilting his head slightly. Nathaniel took a slow sip, eyes never leaving him. "Not the type I pictured my sister with." A quiet tension settled between them. Damon let out a soft chuckle, shifting just enough that the movement could be mistaken for casual. "And what type did you picture?" Nathaniel smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "Someone who knows what he's getting into." Eleanor felt something stir in her chest. Damon's jaw clenched, just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but Eleanor saw it. She saw the flicker of irritation, the brief flash of something that looked suspiciously like doubt. It lasted only a second before he forced another easy laugh, downed the rest of his drink, and handed the empty glass off to a passing waiter. "Good to know I have your approval, Nathaniel," he said, his voice still smooth but lacking its earlier ease. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind." Nathaniel lifted his glass in a mock toast. "You do that." Eleanor almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she drained the rest of her champagne and set the glass down on a passing tray. Damon had always been good at controlling a room, but he had never been good at controlling his temper. She had seen glimpses of it before. Small moments when his patience had worn thin, when his frustration had slipped through the cracks of his carefully curated charm. Tonight, the cracks were wider. She had seen it in the way his expression tightened when her father spoke to him earlier, when it became clear that the Sinclair family had no intention of granting him unrestricted access to their wealth. She had seen it in the way his grip had tensed on her waist during their first dance, in the way his laughter had become just a touch too sharp as the night wore on. And she saw it now, as he turned away from Nathaniel, jaw tight, hands curling at his sides, before he forced himself to relax. He was losing control, and he knew it. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her mind suddenly clear, the noise of the reception fading into the background. For the first time that evening, she felt something close to satisfaction. Damon Caldwell had walked into this marriage believing he was securing power, but he had underestimated her. And tonight, for the first time, he was beginning to realize his mistake. The evening had reached its peak. Laughter swelled through the garden, champagne flowed endlessly, and the illusion of celebration wrapped around the guests like a finely woven tapestry. From the outside, it was a perfect night, a union of two powerful families, a marriage that signified strength and prosperity. But Eleanor Sinclair saw through the illusion. She stood near the grand fountain, her fingers wrapped loosely around the stem of a half-empty champagne flute, her gaze drifting over the scene before her. Damon was still performing, his voice carrying over the low hum of conversation, his laughter deliberate, calculated. His presence was magnetic as ever, but Eleanor could see what no one else did. The strain in his posture, the fleeting tightness of his jaw, the way his fingers tapped idly against his glass. A nervous habit she had only noticed once before, during a particularly tense business negotiation he had nearly lost. Damon Caldwell was unraveling. Slowly, but surely, and she was going to let him. Her gaze shifted toward the ballroom where the wedding cake, a towering, 6-tier masterpiece of white and gold, had been wheeled onto the main stage. It gleamed under the soft lighting, its delicate sugar flowers carefully placed, the design flawless. A hush fell over the crowd as the guests turned their attention toward it, anticipation thick in the air. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The traditional cake cutting. The first act the couple would perform together as husband and wife. Eleanor inhaled deeply, smoothing her hands down the front of her gown, masking the storm that churned beneath her skin. She made her way toward the cake, feeling every pair of eyes in the room shift toward her. Damon was already there, waiting. The expression on his face was unreadable, but Eleanor knew better than to mistake his silence for stillness. There was something in his posture, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. He was still fuming from his earlier encounter with Nathaniel, still stewing over the fact that her family had made it clear he would never have the financial control he had assumed would be his. She stepped beside him, careful not to let their bodies touch. The cameras were trained on them now, their every move documented, immortalized. A silver knife was placed in her hand, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. Damon reached for it as well, his fingers brushing against hers, his touch colder than the steel of the blade. Together they cut through the first layer, a smooth, precise motion. Polite applause filled the space. And then came the part everyone was waiting for, the tradition where the newlyweds fed each other the first bite. Eleanor hesitated only for a fraction of a second, lifting a small piece carefully onto her fork before raising it toward his lips. Damon held her gaze as he accepted it, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he chewed. Then it was his turn. She knew what was coming before it happened. She saw it in the way he took a much larger piece than necessary, the way his grip on the cake tightened just slightly. And in that brief, fleeting moment, she could see it all. The anger, the bruised ego, the desperate need to reclaim power in whatever small way he could. He moved swiftly, deliberately. The cake smashed against her cheek, soft frosting smeared across her skin, dripping down onto the delicate lace of her gown. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The laughter Damon had expected did not come. Instead, there was silence. A thick, suffocating silence that wrapped around the reception hall, pressing down like a heavy storm cloud. Eleanor did not move. She did not react. She simply stood there, letting the weight of what he had just done settle into the air. The whispers began almost immediately. Did that just happen? He'll just threw that cake right in her face. And that wasn't playful, that wasn't... A glass was hastily set down somewhere in the room, the sound punctuating the murmurs like a sharp note in an otherwise muted melody. Her father had stood up. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her mother press a hand against his arm, stopping him before he could take a step forward. Not yet. Not here. Eleanor inhaled slowly, reaching for the napkin that had been left on the table beside her. She wiped the frosting from her cheek in a slow, deliberate motion, her fingers steady. She met Damon's gaze, and for the first time that night, she saw something new in his eyes. Doubt, uncertainty, a flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong move. She let the silence stretch a moment longer, ensuring that Then, with quiet, devastating clarity, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception did not recover. Not really. People tried to pretend, of course. The band resumed playing. The waitstaff continued serving. The guests attempted to shift their focus back to their drinks, their conversations. But the energy had changed. The illusion had cracked. Eleanor did not return to the ballroom. Instead, she retreated to the private bridal suite upstairs, peeling the soiled fabric of her wedding gown away from her body, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. A woman covered in the remnants of what should have been a celebration. Pam just threw that cake right in her face. Oh, that wasn't playful. That wasn't... A glass was hastily set down somewhere in the room, the sound punctuating the murmurs like a sharp note in an otherwise muted melody. Her father had stood up. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her mother press a hand against his arm, stopping him before he could take a step forward. Not yet. Not here. Eleanor inhaled slowly, reaching for the napkin that had been left on the table beside her. She wiped the frosting from her cheek in a slow, deliberate motion, her fingers steady. She met Damon's gaze, and for the first time that night, she saw something new in his eyes. Doubt, uncertainty, a flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong move. It had moved. She let the silence stretch a moment longer, ensuring that everyone in the room felt it. Then, with quiet, devastating clarity, she turned on her heel and walked away. The reception did not recover. Not really. People tried to pretend, of course. The band resumed playing, the waitstaff continued serving, the guests attempted to shift their focus back to their drinks, their conversations. But the energy had changed. The illusion had cracked. Eleanor did not return to the ballroom. Instead, she retreated to the private bridal suite upstairs, peeling the soiled fabric of her wedding gown away from her body, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. A woman covered in the remnants of what should have been a celebration. A woman who had allowed herself to believe, for a time, that she could navigate this marriage on her own terms. She should have known better. There was no salvaging this. She had given Damon every opportunity to prove that there was something in him worth trusting. And he had just proven, without a shadow of a doubt, that there was not. A knock sounded at the door. She didn't need to ask who it was. Her mother entered first, followed closely by her father. Vivian's expression was unreadable, though Eleanor could see the sharpness in her eyes. The kind of sharpness that only emerged when something truly unforgivable had occurred. Edward, however, looked ready to tear through walls. "Darling," Vivian said carefully, stepping toward her. "You don't have to make any decisions tonight." But Eleanor already had. She met her mother's gaze through the mirror. This is over. And for the first time that evening, she felt something close to relief. Because she had been waiting for a reason. And now she had one. The final, undeniable confirmation that she would never, could never, spend her life with a man like Damon Caldwell. She had once believed that she could bend the terms of this marriage to suit her, that she could outmaneuver him, control the pieces in a way that ensured her own power. But power meant nothing if she allowed herself to be degraded. And Eleanor Sinclair did not belong to anyone. By the time the night was over, Damon would know that, and by the time the world woke up tomorrow, they would all know it too. The sound of the reception below had dulled into a distant murmur, a symphony of meaningless laughter and clinking glasses that no longer held any weight. Eleanor Sinclair stood in the center of the bridal suite, her wedding gown ruined, the once pristine fabric stained with the remnants of the cake that had been smeared across her face in front of hundreds of people. She had never felt clearer in her life. Vivian and Edward Sinclair stood near the entrance, their presence imposing even in silence. Her mother was composed as ever, her expression unreadable, but Eleanor could see the fire behind her eyes, the quiet, simmering rage that only surfaced when something truly irreparable had occurred. Her father, on the other hand, was not nearly as controlled. His jaw was clenched, his hands tucked into the pockets of his suit, as though he was physically restraining himself from turning on his heel and walking straight downstairs to handle this in a far less civilized manner. It would be so easy, Eleanor realized, so easy to let him. But she had no interest in causing a scene, not in the way Damon expected. She would not be the woman who screamed and cried, who made herself small, who allowed herself to be turned into a spectacle. That was the game Damon had been playing, the trap he had set, the humiliation he had counted on her swallowing. She refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, she turned toward the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, unflinching. There was no weakness in the woman looking back at her now. No uncertainty. No illusion left to cling to. Eleanor reached for the delicate comb in her hair, sliding it out with an effortless motion. One by one, she removed the pins, letting her dark waves fall over her shoulders. "Darling," Vivian finally spoke, her voice smooth, careful. "You don't have to decide anything tonight." But Eleanor had already decided. "This is over," she said simply. Edward let out a breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. He had never approved of Damon Caldwell. He had tolerated him, had allowed this arrangement to proceed, under the assumption that Eleanor knew what she was doing. But now there was no need for pretense. "Good," her father said, his voice low, firm. "Because if you weren't walking away from this, I'd be dragging you out of here myself." A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Edward turned before Eleanor could respond, yanking the door open to reveal Nathaniel standing in the hallway. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "He's coming up here," Nathaniel said, his tone unreadable. Eleanor met his gaze. Of course, Damon was coming. Because this was what men like him did. They pushed boundaries. They tested limits. They demanded explanations when things didn't go their way. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, smoothing the fabric of her gown where the remnants of frosting still clung. "Let him in," she said. Nathaniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside, allowing Damon Caldwell to enter the room. He walked in with the same self-assured confidence he always carried, his polished shoes sinking into the plush carpet as his gaze swept over the room. The air smelled of vanilla and orchids, a stark contrast to the lingering scent of whiskey and cigars that clung to him from the reception hall below. His expression was unreadable at first, carefully crafted, measured, but Eleanor saw the tension in his posture, the barely restrained frustration flickering beneath his polished exterior. For the first time that night, Damon Caldwell was not in control. He cleared his throat, offering a tight, forced smile. "I came to talk." Eleanor did not respond. She simply watched him, waiting. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. He had expected something different. An argument, perhaps. A confrontation he could twist back in his favor. But she gave him nothing. Damon's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Are you really going to do this?" His voice was low, just a fraction above a whisper, but in the quiet of the room it felt deafening. Walk away from this marriage over a joke? No one moved. No one spoke. Her father remained near the door, a silent barrier between Damon and the only exit. Nathaniel leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, his stare a quiet warning. Her mother stood to her right, silent but imposing. Eleanor? She did not so much as blink. Damon's jaw tightened further. His composure was slipping. "This is ridiculous, Eleanor," he pressed, stepping closer. "It was just cake, a stupid tradition. Everyone laughed." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No one laughed." The words landed like a blade against his pride. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "So that's it then? You're going to humiliate me in front of everyone? Make a spectacle out of this over nothing?" Her father shifted slightly, but Eleanor held up a hand, stopping him before he could speak. She did not need protection. She had already won. She took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them just slightly. "This was never going to work," she said softly. The certainty in her voice made something inside him tighten. Damon had expected control. He had expected to be the one dictating the terms. He had never expected to lose. He let out a sharp exhale, his mask slipping for the briefest moment before he forced himself to smirk. "So what now?" His voice was taunting, edged with bitterness. "You think you can just walk away?" She smiled then, not the kind of smile he had ever seen from her before. Not warm, not charming, not meant to soothe or comfort. It was the kind of smile that promised inevitability. "I already have." And that was it. Damon stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for someone to tell him this wasn't real. That she was bluffing. That this was just a momentary lapse in judgment. But no one did, because everyone in that room knew the truth. Eleanor Sinclair was done. Damon's smirk faltered, just slightly. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, the silence swallowing the space he had occupied just moments before. Her mother exhaled slowly, her eyes filled with something unreadable. Her father nodded once, as if confirming what he had always known. Nathaniel smirked slightly, as though unsurprised that Damon had left without putting up more of a fight. Eleanor felt the tension drain from her shoulders. It was over, and for the first time in months, maybe even years, she felt free. The moment Damon walked out of the bridal suite, the silence in the room was deafening. Eleanor stood motionless, staring at the door as it clicked shut behind him, sealing off the last remnants of whatever illusion had remained. He was gone, but his presence still lingered like the stale scent of whiskey and arrogance. She exhaled slowly, unclenching her fingers from the fabric of her ruined gown. Her skin still felt sticky from the frosting, but she no longer noticed it. There were far more important things to deal with now. Her mother was the first to speak. "We need to act quickly." Edward Sinclair was already a step ahead. He had pulled out his phone, his voice calm but firm as he gave quiet, deliberate orders to someone on the other end of the line. Eleanor didn't need to hear the details to know what was happening. The unraveling of Damon Caldwell had begun. Nathaniel smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. He really thought he had this in the bag, he mused, shaking his head. It's almost sad. Almost. Eleanor finally moved, stepping toward the vanity where a fresh towel had been placed. She wiped at the last traces of cake on her skin, her movements slow, methodical. He'll fight this, she murmured. Her mother's reflection appeared behind her in the mirror, sharp eyes watching her carefully. Let him, Vivian said simply. It won't matter. And she was right, because as of this moment, Damon had already lost. The man had spent months believing he had outplayed them. He had walked into this marriage with the confidence of someone who had never known what it was to be outmaneuvered. He had assumed, wrongly, that because he had the Caldwell name, because he had once stood at the peak of society, that he was still untouchable. But the truth was, Damon's power had been slipping long before Eleanor ever entered the picture. His family's wealth had been a facade, their influence built on old reputations that carried no weight in the modern world. He had needed her, needed the Sinclair empire to breathe life back into his crumbling legacy. And now, that lifeline was gone. Her father ended his call and turned toward her. By morning, every business connection he had left will pull away. The funding he was expecting from his father's associates? Gone. His shares in Caldwell Enterprises? Worthless by the end of the week. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about eliminating a threat. His best bet, her father continued, is to try to control the narrative, make it seem like he walked away first. He'll try to salvage his reputation, make it look like you were the one who wasn't ready. Nathaniel snorted. Except no one is going to buy that after tonight. Not after he just humiliated himself in front of half the city. Vivian gave a small, knowing smile. Oh, he'll try. And that was fine. Because no matter what Damon attempted, Eleanor would always be 5 steps ahead. She turned away from the mirror, her decision already made. I want to leave tonight. Her father gave a single nod. We have a jet ready. Of course they did. This was not a family that sat around waiting for things to happen. Nathaniel pulled out his phone. I'll make sure our people handle the guests. The official story will be that the bride and groom left early for their honeymoon. Eleanor let out a breath. The honeymoon. She had nearly forgotten. A luxurious 2-week getaway to the Amalfi Coast, booked months in advance. A trip meant to be the start of a life she had never intended to live. Now, it would be the perfect cover for her disappearance. Vivian stepped closer, reaching out to smooth a stray curl from Eleanor's temple. It was a rare, fleeting moment of tenderness from a woman who had built her life on control. You don't have to say anything to him, not another word. Eleanor met her mother's gaze. I wasn't planning to. It took less than 20 minutes to change. She stripped out of the wedding gown, letting it pool onto the floor in a discarded heap. The Eleanor Sinclair who had walked down the aisle hours ago had ceased to exist. She dressed in something simple. Black slacks, a fitted cashmere sweater. Clothes that belonged to her, not to the illusion of the woman she had been expected to become. By the time she stepped out of the suite, her parents and brother were waiting. Everything is ready, her father confirmed. Nathaniel lifted a brow. No second thoughts? Eleanor didn't hesitate. None. As they moved through the estate, the reception was still alive in full force. Guests continued drinking, dancing, pretending not to acknowledge the tension that had settled over the evening like a storm cloud. She caught glimpses of the whispers, the way people turned just slightly to watch her pass, their expressions carefully schooled into neutrality. They didn't want to be caught staring, but they couldn't help it. Damon was nowhere to be seen. Not that it mattered. By the time he realized she was gone, it would already be too late. Her family's security detail ushered them into the waiting cars, engines already running. As she slid into the back seat, Eleanor felt the weight of the night settle over her, heavy and final. But there was no regret, no doubt, only relief. Nathaniel glanced at her from across the car as they pulled away. "Where to?" She exhaled slowly, watching as the estate disappeared behind them. Anywhere but here. The car picked up speed, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows. By the time the sun rose, the world would wake up to the news. Eleanor Sinclair had walked away, and Damon Caldwell would never recover. The night passed in a blur of movement. The jet departed before Damon had a chance to react, slipping into the sky under the cover of darkness, leaving behind nothing but whispers and unanswered questions. Eleanor sat by the window, watching as the city lights shrank into the horizon, her mind impossibly clear. She had expected to feel something, maybe regret, maybe anger, but there was nothing. Just an eerie sense of calm, like the moment after a storm when the sky is still, heavy with the scent of rain, but the destruction has already passed. Nathaniel sat across from her, swirling a glass of scotch in his hand, his expression unreadable. "You know," he mused, "this is the part where most people would ask if you're okay." Eleanor let out a quiet breath, her fingers tracing the edge of the empty champagne flute in front of her. "And what would I say to that?" Her brother smirked, tilting his glass toward her. Exactly. Her parents had opted for another jet, allowing Eleanor and Nathaniel the privacy of their own flight, a deliberate choice. Vivian and Edward Sinclair were not the type to linger in emotional moments, nor did they believe in indulging in sentimentality. They had done their part. The rest was up to Eleanor. "Where are we actually going?" she asked after a long silence, turning away from the window to face Nathaniel fully. He took a slow sip before answering. "Somewhere private. No press. No eyes. You get to decide what happens next." What happens next? The weight of those words settled over her, heavy yet liberating. She had spent months walking toward an inevitable future. One that had been planned, arranged, decided long before she had the chance to resist. But now, for the first time in as long as she could remember, the next step belonged to her. And Damon? Damon Caldwell would wake up to a very different reality. When the morning sun finally rose, the first wave of headlines hit. The billion-dollar wedding ends in chaos. Sinclair heiress disappears overnight. Marriage or business deal, the truth behind the Sinclair-Caldwell wedding. Eleanor Sinclair leaves groom and family fortune behind. What happened? The media frenzy was instantaneous, a wildfire spreading through the highest circles of society with ruthless efficiency. News anchors speculated. Columnists picked apart the evening, analyzing every detail with the precision of a forensic team investigating a crime scene. And Damon? Damon was drowning. He woke in the master suite of the Caldwell estate, alone. His head ached from the whiskey, his body heavy with exhaustion. But the instant he turned over and saw the empty space beside him, reality struck. His phone was vibrating relentlessly on the nightstand, notifications flooding in with increasing urgency. He grabbed it, squinting against the glare of the screen. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages. But one stood out. A single text from Elias. Turn on the news, now. Damon's stomach twisted as he reached for the remote, his fingers tightening around it as he flicked on the screen. The broadcast was already in progress, the anchor speaking with that careful blend of professionalism and barely concealed intrigue. It's the scandal that has everyone talking. The wedding of the year, abruptly cut short as Eleanor Sinclair left her own reception and disappeared before sunrise. Sources close to the family confirm that the heiress has departed on a private jet, leaving behind an uncertain future for the once powerful union between the Sinclairs and the Caldwells. The footage changed to clips from the night before. Eleanor standing motionless as the cake dripped down her cheek, the reception guests watching in stunned silence, the moment stretching endlessly in the uncomfortable weight of Damon's own mistake. He felt his pulse quicken. What does this mean for Damon Caldwell? His family's business has been in decline for years, with many speculating that the merger with the Sinclair fortune was meant to restore his financial standing. But with Eleanor's departure, sources suggest that Sinclair Enterprises has already begun withdrawing its investments in Caldwell Industries. What remains to be seen is whether Damon can recover from this devastating fallout. Damon barely heard the rest. He threw the remote across the room, the crash reverberating against the walls, his vision narrowing with fury. This wasn't just bad. This was catastrophic. Everything he had worked for, every calculated move, every carefully played hand, had been dismantled in a single night. He had assumed Eleanor would react like any other woman in her position, that she would cry, yell, make a scene, give him something to work with, something he could manipulate. But instead, she had done the one thing he hadn't prepared for. She had walked away. And worse, she had done it without giving him a chance to control the narrative. Now, the entire world was watching him, waiting to see how he would respond, if he would rise or crumble under the weight of it all. The phone buzzed again. Another message. This one from his father. "Fix this." Damon let out a sharp, humorless laugh, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Fix this? There was no fixing this. By the time he had even processed what was happening, Eleanor Sinclair had already disappeared, leaving him with nothing but the ruins of the future he had been so certain was his. He grabbed his suit jacket from the chair, shoving his arms through the sleeves as he stalked toward the door. If she thought she could just walk away, if she thought this was over, she was mistaken. Because Damon Caldwell had never been a man who accepted defeat. And this wasn't over. Not yet. Across the ocean, Eleanor sat on the terrace of a private villa, the sun warming her skin as she sipped from a cup of coffee. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, waves crashing against the shore, the sound rhythmic, soothing. Her phone buzzed beside her. Nathaniel, reading the news on his own device, smirked. "Looks like he finally woke up." Eleanor glanced at the screen, unsurprised to see Damon's name flashing across it. She didn't answer. He didn't even hesitate before silencing the call and setting the phone aside. Nathaniel chuckled. Cold. Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Oh, underestimated me." Nathaniel tilted his glass toward her in a mock toast. His first mistake. Eleanor smiled, slow and knowing. And his last. The waves crashed steadily against the rocky coastline, their rhythmic pulse a stark contrast to the chaos that Eleanor Sinclair had left behind. The air here was different, clean, untainted, untouched by the weight of society's expectations. The morning sun had risen high over the Mediterranean, casting golden reflections over the endless expanse of water. Eleanor stood at the edge of the villa's terrace, coffee in hand, gazing at the horizon. She had always imagined what freedom might feel like, but never like this. Not like stepping off a plane and knowing she had left behind everything, her past, her name, the carefully constructed life that had been designed for her. Not like knowing that somewhere, miles and miles away, Damon Caldwell was watching his world burn. Her phone vibrated again, another call, another message she wouldn't answer. Damon had been calling nonstop since the news had broken. He had left voicemails that started controlled and infuriatingly confident, his usual tone of condescension, as if he believed she had simply made an emotional mistake, one she would regret. Then, as the silence stretched, the messages changed. "Eleanor, this is ridiculous. We need to talk. I'm willing to be reasonable about this. The media is spinning this out of control. You need to come back and fix it." Then, the cracks in his carefully cultivated demeanor began to show. "Oh, bah. You have any idea what you've done? You think you can just disappear? You think this is over?" It was the last voicemail. The one left at 3 a.m, his voice raw with exhaustion and barely suppressed fury. That had finally made Eleanor smile. "You don't get to walk away from this, Eleanor." But she already had. Nathaniel stepped out onto the terrace, stretching lazily as he tossed his phone onto the table. He was barefoot, dressed in linen pants and a loose button-down, looking far too relaxed given the destruction they had just unleashed. "Well," he drawled, pouring himself another cup of coffee. "He's panicking." Eleanor took a slow sip from her cup, her expression unbothered. "Good." Her brother smirked. "He's scrambling to do damage control, but it's not working. No one believes he left you. No one believes he's the victim here." Eleanor wasn't surprised. The world had seen what had happened that night. They had seen Damon's arrogance, his miscalculation, the way he had humiliated himself without even realizing it. And most importantly, they had seen her walk away, without a word, without a fight, without looking back. "You should really read some of these articles," Nathaniel mused, scrolling through his phone. "They're calling you the runaway heiress. Apparently, you're now a symbol of empowerment or something." Eleanor let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "That's ironic. Because none of this was about proving a point." She set her cup down on the marble table beside her, stretching her arms slightly. "I didn't leave to make a statement. I left because I refused to let him have control over my life." Nathaniel lifted an eyebrow. "Well, regardless, you're an icon now. Women everywhere are raising their glasses to you. Men are terrified. Damon is probably smashing expensive objects as we speak." That thought pleased her more than she was willing to admit. She had always known that walking away would ruin him. Damon Caldwell had been teetering on the edge for years, held together only by the illusion of power. He had built his life on his last name, on the prestige that had been passed down to him. But prestige meant nothing when stripped of substance. And now, without her, without the Sinclair name, he had nothing. No money, no business, no allies. Only the weight of his own arrogance. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the dozens of unread messages. Calls from mutual acquaintances, reporters, people she barely knew but who suddenly had something to say. And then, at the bottom of the list, Demon. She hovered her thumb over his name. For a moment, she considered answering, not because she cared what he had to say, not because she wanted to hear the desperation in his voice, but because she knew that silence was the cruelest punishment of all. Without a word, she locked her screen and set the phone down once more. Nathaniel watched her, amused. "You really aren't going to answer, are you?" Eleanor smiled, slow and knowing. Her brother let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Eleanor turned her gaze back toward the ocean, breathing in the salt-kissed air. Damon Caldwell had spent months believing he was in control. He had thought he was playing chess while she was playing checkers. He had thought he had already won. And yet, here she was, free. And there he was, drowned in. She reached for her sunglasses, slipping them onto her face as she leaned back in her chair. "Come on," she said, standing. "I want to go for a swim." Nathaniel shook his head, laughing under his breath as he followed her toward the infinity pool. Cold-blooded, Elle. Absolutely cold-blooded. Eleanor only smiled. The game was over, and she had won. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. It's not just a tale of betrayal and revenge. It's a reminder of something far more important. Power is not always about money or status. True power lies in knowing your worth, in refusing to be controlled, in walking away when you are no longer respected. Eleanor Sinclair didn't have to fight. She didn't have to scream. She won by choosing herself. And in life, sometimes the most powerful move you can make is the one that others never see coming. This story is about more than just a ruined wedding. It's about self-respect, about refusing to settle, about understanding that silence can be the loudest response of all. What did you think? What would you have done in Eleanor's place? Let us know in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. We have more compelling narratives, lessons, and drama coming your way. Until next time, remember, walking away isn't weakness. Sometimes, it's the most powerful thing you can do.